I spent almost 11 years in the United States Army, and I didn't retire. I ETS, which means my contract came to an end and I got out. And a lot of people ask me, why on earth did you stay in for that long and not just ride it out till retirement? The analogy I like to give is that it was kind of like walking from California to Colorado and somebody telling you that, hey, you're halfway to New York City. Why don't you just keep on walking? Well, that was a really long walk. There was a lot of painful kind of experiences along that journey. And why on earth would I want to continue doing that if I could just stop right here? So we're going to get into why it turned into being that long of a journey for me, and that was not the original plan, but we're going to talk about that. So make sure that you're hitting that subscribe button, because here on this channel I like to educate you about the United States Army, whether you're interested in joining or currently a soldier in the Army. I like to give you guys the best knowledge that I can, but today's video, we're talking specifically why I was in for so long, but yet didn't retire. Probably important to understand my original plan. My original plan was to join the Army, only do the 4-year contract that I was initially going to do. I was going to become a mechanic and then hopefully get out of the Army and go off to a trade school to do automotive in like a trade school type of environment, and then hopefully try to get like a job working in a NASCAR was ultimately the goal. I wanted to like work in the garage though, not like in a pit crew, but in the garage. That was my goal at the time. Mechanic in the Army, go to school for automotive, become a mechanic working in the garage in NASCAR. Well, that is not what happened, obviously. It was during MEPS that they found that I had a red-green colorblind. So that eliminated me from being able to be a mechanic in the Army. And I guess I'm actually kind of thankful for that, because I did kind of lose interest in wanting to do automotive. Plus, once I got in the Army, those guys work really, really hard. And I don't know if I would have enjoyed that. Not that I don't mind some hard work, but they really, really work hard, especially on a deployment. So that kind of scratched my original plan. So I ended up just kind of settling on being an 88 Mike, a motor transportation operator, being a truck driver in the Army, and figured that, okay, well, I'll just suck it up. I'll do that for 4 years, and then I'll get out and still go to college, and then hopefully pursue my dream still. So I went to my first duty station, which was Fort Riley, Kansas. I spent 2 years there, and then I came up on orders for Korea. So then I got sent up to Korea. Korea is supposed to be a 1-year tour, but around the time I went to Korea is right at the very, very beginning of the Iraq War. So everybody in Korea was getting extended for an additional 6 months to have to stay in that location for a year and a half, basically, before you'd be allowed to go back, since there wasn't really any soldiers to replace people that were going to Korea or were in Korea, because they were all busy going on deployments. That kind of put me in a tough situation, because that was going to make it to where I would only have about 6 months left in the Army once my time in Korea was going to be up. And that was not enough time for them to be willing to send me back to the United States to get out of the Army. So that meant I would have to get out of the Army from Korea. Trying to get out of the Army from another country brings on a lot of problems, possibly, right? I would not really have anywhere to stay, to live. I wouldn't be able to like find an apartment, find a place to live without having to try to, do a lot of research online, trying to get somebody to try to set it up for me to have a place to go to the United States. So it was most likely going to be a scenario where you'd have to move back in with like family, with your parents, until you could establish a place to live. And I did not want to move back to my hometown. My hometown's a very small town, and that was not really what I wanted to do. I didn't want to go move back to that small town. I wanted to probably move to a larger city and kind of get established there. So that was going to be very difficult to do. Also, it was going to make it very difficult to be able to line everything up, whether to get a job or whatever I was going to do to be able to provide some kind of income once I got out. So nonetheless, it made it very difficult for me to be able to transition out of the Army from another country. So I went with the option to re-enlist, and I went with the lowest possible kind of contract I could do, which was a 2-year re-enlistment. That 2-year re-enlistment allowed me to choose a duty station, gave me a little bit of a bonus, not very much of a bonus. I think it was like $2,000, and then after taxes, like maybe like $1,200 or something along those lines. But it gave me those options, so I chose to go to Fort Carson, Colorado. So that did result in me doing 2 years in Korea instead, because during that re-enlistment, it was kind of like a process of me choosing to stay in Korea for an extra year and then going back to the States. So after those 2 years in Korea, I went to Fort Carson, Colorado, where I arrived with a 3rd ACR, which now they're the 3rd CR right now out of Fort Hood, Texas, but at the time they were in Fort Carson, Colorado. When I arrived at that unit, they had just come back from Iraq. They were currently on leave and everything, so I was already hearing from the leadership that, hey, we already know that in a year, we're gonna be deploying back to Iraq, so be ready for that. At this time, there was still a thing called stop loss in place, which meant that because of the kind of need for soldiers to deploy to these environments like Iraq and Afghanistan, they could involuntarily extend your contract for at least a year. Actually, not really at least a year, maximum of a year. So they could go and make you stay in the Army for a maximum of an additional year on top of whatever you had left. So if you were supposed to get out, and let's say at this time it would have been like 2005, I think it was, 2004, then they could add another year onto your contract in order for you to be able to go on this deployment. So they told me, you're gonna get stop lossed, all right? You only have a year left on your contract. We are going to put you on stop loss, and you're gonna have to go and do 2 more years in the Army, or you can just re-enlist, get a bonus out of it. You're gonna be doing that amount of time in the first place. So there I was, re-enlisting again for another 2 years, the bare minimum that they would let me re-enlist for. So I deployed to Iraq with the 3rd ACR out of Fort Carson, Colorado. We went on a 1-year tour to Iraq, and I came back and had approximately about 1 year left in the Army. Here it was, again, at the kind of pivotal point. I got 1 year left in the Army, cool. Ride it out here at Colorado and Fort Carson and get out of the Army. Well, bad news. 3rd ACR is moving to Fort Hood, Texas, and I do not have enough time left in the Army to go with them to Fort Hood, Texas, which I didn't want to anyways. I wanted to stay on Colorado and stay on Fort Carson, but I also didn't have enough time left in the Army for them to want to keep me on Fort Carson because of this unit of action thing they wanted to be able to do with, units that were heavily deploying at that time. So basically they said that you're probably gonna come up on orders to go back to Korea. And that was going to put me back in the original situation that I originally had to re-enlist for the Army in the first place. So you guessed it, I had to re-enlist again. So I re-enlisted for, again, the bare minimum they would let me re-enlist for, which was 2 years. So I re-enlisted for 2 years, got again another very small bonus, and re-enlisted to stay in Fort Carson, Colorado. So I was moved over to 2-9 Cav, which later changed over to 410 Cav, and that was my unit I was going to, and of course, they were deploying to Iraq. So that means I had to go to Iraq again. Now, at least the bright side of it was that at this point in time, during the beginning of the deployment to Iraq, they had gotten rid of stop loss. Stop loss had been removed, no longer was stop loss a thing, so they were getting rid of it. Now, there was some soldiers like on my deployment, they got stop loss to go to this deployment, but during the deployment, they made it to where they were no longer going to stop loss anybody, but the people that were still on stop loss had to finish out the remainder of their time and then be able to get out of the Army when they came back, but that did mean that I didn't have to worry about being stop lossed anymore. So that finally allowed me to, when I came back from Iraq that second time, to be able to start the transition to try to get out of the Army, which did put me in the position to where I was getting out of the Army with it was like 10 years and I think like 8-9 months, something like that. It was almost 11 years, not quite 11 years, but pretty close to 11 years total. So through this process, I didn't really want to stay in the Army as long as I did. I just kept on finding myself in situations where if I tried to get out at that point in time, I was gonna probably screw up things, make it difficult on myself for transitioning out of the Army. So in order to try to put me in a better place for getting out of the Army, I kept on re-enlisting and re-enlisting and re-enlisting until it finally got to a point where, okay, no more obstacles. I'm finally in a place where I am able to transition out of the Army. Now, that was a whole nother process, trying to get out of the Army, trying to execute a plan once I was out of the Army and what to do. And if you'd like to learn about that process, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. But on the note of me getting out of the Army, I did get out of the Army as an E5. I was technically E5 promotable. And if you'd like to learn why I was not able to make it to E6, I do have a video right here that explains all about that. Thanks for hanging out. Check out the links down in the description box down below. I'm Christopher Chaos, and I'll see you next time. See ya.